Welcome to the EKG Guy. If this is your first time, so glad you could join us this week. And I just want to first off thank everyone that's bought the course, our new course that we launched not too long ago. We've had hundreds of you buy this past week, and really grateful for your support. So this week's EKG of the week is our 67-year-old female with metastatic lung cancer presenting with shortness of breath. This was a pretty sad case I had on the chest service this week, so I thought I'd share it with you. All right. So again, take a chance to try to go through it yourself. Try to go through the regularity, rate, rhythm origin, ventricular axis, atrial conduction, AV or atrioventricular, IV, intraventricular conduction. Okay, notice I've changed this from the waveforms to PR segment, ST segment, Q wave, or QTC interval, and anything else. Okay, we'll go through this together, but pause the video when you're ready, restart it, and we'll walk through this all. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to go through this yourself. All right. So this is our 67-year-old female with metastatic lung cancer. Okay, it was an adenocarcinoma presenting with shortness of breath. Okay, so first off, with this EKG, all right, we want to look at the regularity. And one of the key things that we do is try to pick out those intervals that are the same. Okay, and oftentimes we'll find an R wave. So here's lead V1. Okay, this R wave here, and this R wave. And we call that the R to R interval. Okay, and if you measure that throughout, find the next R wave, which is this one here, measure it to the next one, and so forth. If these are all the same, we call this a regular rhythm. Okay, and in this case, actually, if you were to measure all these out, they are pretty much the same. Okay, and that's why we would call this a regular rhythm. So a regular rhythm here. Okay, if it was not regular, we'd call it irregular, and then we'd have to decide if it's irregularly irregular or regularly irregular. Okay, so we won't get into that because this is a regular rhythm. Okay, now you can use any of the intervals. We use the R to R interval, but you could pick out these P waves here and measure the same throughout. Okay, as long as you're consistent. So far we have a regular rhythm, and next we want to find the rate. Okay, in this case we will find the ventricular rate, and that way we will use these QRS complexes or the T waves. Okay, we'll focus on these QRS complexes because they're the easiest to spot. So because we have a regular rhythm, there's a few ways we can find it. Okay, the first way, which you can use for both regular and irregular rhythms, is knowing that from beginning all the way to the end of our standard 12 lead, which we're looking at here, is 10 seconds. And 10 seconds times 6 is 60 seconds. And you should know that equals 1 minute. Okay, that means if we count the complexes going across, multiply by 6, we can get the rate in beats per minute. Okay, so let's do that right here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Okay, so you do 16 times 6. All right, so let's do that math right here. 6, 3, so 96 is that average rate. Okay, so we got an estimate of 96 beats per minute as the ventricular rate because we're using the QRS complexes to find it. Okay, in this case, we'd also see the atrial rate being the same because they're one-to-one relationship. So that's one way we can find it. And we can use this approach for both regular or irregular rhythms. So if you want to learn only one approach, I would use this one. Okay. Next approach, okay, we'll show it just because we have a regular rhythm, is finding a QRS complex that falls on one of those thick lines. Okay. And you can use, say, this one here. Okay, pretty close, falling right there. And find the next R wave, which is this one here, right there. Okay, and you want to count the number of thick lines, these thick lines between them. So 1, 2, and it's coming just around 3. So you would do 300 divided by the number of those thick lines, which we said was 3, and you get 300 over 3 is 100 beats per minute. So that's a close estimate. Okay, so close estimate, again, 100 beats per minute. So it's a little less than that because if you calculate it, it's just beyond that 3 beats. Okay, with fast rhythms you could use the same thing but do 1500 over the number of small boxes. So instead of the large boxes you would use the small ones. Alright, we won't get into that here. So the actual estimate that the machine gave us, which in this case we can trust, was actually 96 beats per minute. Okay, so that's a good estimate of the rate. We were quite close. Next, we want to get the rhythm origin, okay? Now, in this case, we have QRS duration that looks almost somewhat wide, okay? So somewhat wide there. The actual QRS duration was 120 milliseconds, okay? So just at the upper limits of normal, okay? And we'll see if something else may be contributing to that shortly, but let's see here. So we have a QRS complex that's just on the upper limits of normal, but we have P waves that are preceding it, okay? So if you look at here at lead 1, these are P waves. And notice that every P wave has a QRS complex that follows, okay? So P wave, and lead V1 this is. These are all P waves, and notice that they all have a QRS complex, this here, that's following it. Okay, meaning that our atria and our ventricles are working together, meaning that the atria are contracting and it's coming down to the ventricles to allow them to depolarize. So in this case, we have to now ask ourselves, we likely have an atrial rhythm, but is it coming from the sinus node or not? Okay, and do you remember how we do that? Okay, remember, we're all about understanding why we see what we see on the EKG, so let's make sure we know that. Okay, so just to go over this again, here's our box diagram. This is the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle, and left ventricle. Okay, we know that our sinus node sits up here, so that means if we're in sinus rhythm, the rhythm's originating from the sinus node, and that's what we're trying to figure out. Now from the sinus node, we have some pathways, okay? We have these internodal pathways, Bachman bundle that comes to the left side, the AV node here in the right atrium, then we have the His bundle that subdivides into a right bundle branch. Then we have the left bundle branch that has a left anterior and posterior fascicle. And from the right bundle branch and the left anterior and posterior fascicles, then we go to the ventricular Purkinje fibers and then to our cardiomyocytes, and that's how the electrical impulse spreads. So now we're saying, is the impulse originating from this area here? Okay, and that's the sinus node. All right, in other words, is sinus rhythm present? So now let's take our right atrium, this one here, and overlay it on this. Okay, so I've only taken that right atrium. Okay, again, we will put our sinus node up here. Remember, we have our pathways that come down to our AV node and so forth. So notice that the impulse is heading in that direction. Okay, now that's important. So let's just erase this here. So it's important. That means our impulse is heading in this direction. And that's good to know because normal P wave axis is between 0 and positive 70 degrees. This is the normal P wave axis. So what leads sit there? Well, we know that lead 1 sits here, the positive end of it. Lead AVF is here. Lead 2 is at positive 60. Okay. Lead 3 is here. Then we have horizontal plane V4, V5, and V6. And remember, AVR is here. So notice that our impulse is heading towards these leads here. That means it's going to have an upright P wave or positive P wave in those leads and a negative P wave as it moves away from AVR. Okay, so that's what sinus rhythm should show. Remember, originating from the sinus node. So let's look at our EKG here. Here's lead 1. We see an upright P wave. Okay, lead 2. Okay, lead AVF. Hard to make out any P waves. Okay. Let's look at the lateral leads. Again, here's V4. Some P waves there. V5. V6. Okay, and then AVR, we said they would be negative, and that's exactly what we see. Okay, so in fact, sinus rhythm is present here. So we would say sinus rhythm is present, and hopefully now that makes sense why, what we're looking for with sinus rhythm. And notice that we're focusing on the P waves only. Okay. All right, so next we want to look at the ventricular axis. Okay, in ventricular axis, that means we are going to focus on those QRS complex. So let's erase some of this here and now look at the ventricular axis. Again, just like the P wave had that axis between 0 and positive 70 degrees, the ventricular axis also has its own, okay, and it is slightly different. Actually, this one sits between negative 30 and about positive 110 degrees. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So again, negative 30 would be here, degrees, and this would be positive 110 degrees. Okay, So that's the normal axis is in this range. We call that normal. If it's up here, we call this a left axis deviation. This is a right axis deviation. This is a northwest axis shift. Okay, north, west, so we call it northwest axis. Okay, so remember, the leads we have to look at here, let's draw this out again. Lead 1 sits here, the positive end, and that's at 0 degrees, okay, which is here. And then AVF, the positive end, sits down at positive 90 degrees. So those are the leads I want you to focus on. There's many ways to find the axis, but this is a simple way, okay, and tends to hold up pretty well. So let's look here. First, we have lead 1, which is this one, okay, and you're kind of looking, is it positive or negative? Okay, so lead 1, is it positive or negative? And it's almost isoelectric. Okay, so what does that mean? If it's an isoelectric lead, it's going to go like this, okay, meaning the amount above and below the axis is about the same. Okay, hard to tell here. And AVF, the same thing. Okay, maybe a little more negative. You can see these complexes are a little more negative. So from AVF, we'd actually head towards, away from AVF towards this way. Okay, now there's another lead we should use that helps quite a bit, okay, and that's lead 2. So lead 2 sits here, okay, and lead 2 has a axis that goes this way at negative 30 degrees. Remember, negative 30 is what we said was normal, meaning that if lead 2 is positive, it'll go towards our positive end of lead 2 and put us in this range, okay. However, if it's negative, it'll go away from lead 2 and then put us over in this region. Okay, so let's look at lead 2 here. Lead 2, notice these complexes here are mostly negative. Okay, and if it was negative, we'd go away from lead 2. So because it's going away from lead 2, the axis actually lies in this region, and that region is this one here. So in fact, this is a left axis deviation. Okay, the axis was actually negative 53 degrees. So beyond that, actually lying somewhere about here would be negative 53. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. A little tougher one because the complexes are a little small here, but that still comes out right and we were able to get it. So hopefully that makes sense. Make sure you're looking at all the limb leads. You can't always rely on just 2. Okay. Alright, so let's move on to atrial conduction. In atrial conduction, we're looking for any atrial abnormalities, such as atrial enlargement, okay, whether it's left or right atrial enlargement, okay. Are there any delays or anything with conduction in the atria? Well, in this case, there is no evidence of atrial abnormalities. We tend to look at lead 2 and lead V1. Okay, in this case, because there's none, we will move on. I know there's a lot of other EKGs we've done recently that we saw them, so if you're wondering what kind of abnormalities we're talking about, you can look back at those. But in this case, there are no atrial abnormalities. So next we want to look at AV conduction. Okay, in AV conduction, a big portion of it is the PR interval. Okay, and just to go through this again, remember our P wave, our QRS complex, and our T wave. Okay, the P wave, we looked for atrial conduction problems. Okay, the PR interval is from this way until this portion. Okay, and this is where we're looking at AV conduction. Okay, so AV conduction is our PR interval. That tends to be where we see any issues. So the PR interval here that the machine has given us is 176 milliseconds. Remember that the normal PR interval in our adults, which we have here, is 120 to 200 milliseconds, so within our normal limits. So a normal PR interval. The other thing we want to look at and make sure with this is that there's no drop beats, and we mentioned earlier that there's one QRS complex for each P wave that precedes it. Okay, what do I mean by that? Here's one P wave, here's a QRS complex, one P wave, QRS complex, one P wave, QRS. There are no drop beats. Okay, so we can say no drop beats. And there's always consistency. All those intervals are the same. The PR interval is consistent throughout. So we have no AV blocks or any evidence of conduction through that AV node here. Okay. All right. So next we get to IV conduction. And what is IV conduction? That is intraventricular conduction. So what is the conduction within the ventricles? Here we look at the QRS duration. Remember, normal QRS duration in adults is 70 to 110 milliseconds. Now we said earlier that the QRS duration here was 120 milliseconds, okay? And we would consider that on the upper range, if not prolonged area, okay? So this is a prolonged QRS duration. We would call this intraventricular conduction delay, okay? Because it reaches that point. And so what you're looking for here, so if we were to just draw this out again, so notice that we looked at the P wave, we looked at this area here, and now we're looking at the duration of this area here, okay? And we said it was 120 milliseconds, which is 3 small boxes and prolonged, okay? So that's where we're at now, and we said there's a little delay because it's at 120, which is beyond that 110. All right. So that's that, and let's move on to the waveforms, which are these here, okay? And this is where we're going to see some things that are coming up, okay? And specifically, let's focus back on why this may be prolonged, okay? So are there any PR segment abnormalities, okay? So just to draw it again, the PR segment is this area. Is there any elevation or depression anywhere? Well, the complexes are quite small, but if you look at V1, they all look pretty consistent throughout. So no issues there. Are there any ST segment issues? Okay, so let's look at the ST segment, which is this area here. Is it elevated or depressed anywhere? Well, nothing significantly, okay? Maybe a little bit here in V1, a little depression in V6, okay, but that's going to be for another reason that we'll talk about shortly. Okay, so no significant ST segment changes that would suggest ischemia here. How about any Q waves? And why do we look at Q waves? So in this case, a Q wave would be a negative deflection. So let's draw what a Q wave is, okay? So here's our, is there any Q wave there? In fact, there is not. This is an R wave and this is an S wave. A Q wave is one that precedes it. And we look for Q waves here. This would be a Q wave because they may suggest a prior infarct, okay? So if you look here, what you're seeing are these Q waves. Here's in lead 3 and in AVF and even maybe in 2, okay? And they are these initial portions right here. So you can see that. Okay, and this patient actually did have a prior inferior infarct. So those are Q waves in at least 2 of the inferior leads. So there's almost in all 3. So Q waves in 2, 3, and AVF, and those are significant. Okay. The other thing I want you to note is that there are some Q waves in V1, V2, V3, and that should be it, not in V4, because this is an R wave and that's an S wave. So you see one here, here, and here. Okay, if you see them progressing through that, they may suggest an abnormality. So V1 through V3. Okay, and in fact, the patient had a prior anteroseptal infarct. So another significant finding. So V1 to V3 and those inferior leads. Okay, all right. And last, we want to mention the QTC interval. The QTC interval in this patient was 497 milliseconds. That is a prolonged QTC interval, okay? Normal in females should be less than 460 milliseconds, okay? Normal in males is less than 440 milliseconds. Now, it's not until we get close to that 500 that we start changing therapeutic management and such, but this is certainly prolonged, okay? So one thing to keep in mind. So 497 is above that upper limit, and this is a prolonged QTC interval. And that QTC means corrected for the heart rate, okay? Remember, the QT interval is from the beginning here of our QRS complex to the end of the T wave. The QT interval, when we correct for heart rate, we get the QTC interval, and this takes into account variations with heart rate, which can occur with that interval. Okay, all right. Now there was another thing that we wanted to mention here, and it's that these are QR prime complexes. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Well, normally with a right bundle branch block, you may see those rabbit ears, right, or something that may resemble like that, where you have an RS R prime complex. Now, if you have an infarct involving this region of the heart, okay, that initial impulse, this initial R wave, may be lost. Instead, you get a downward deflection or a Q wave showing that inferior infarct, and therefore it looks like something like this. So we would call this a QR prime complex. All right, and if you look here at V6, these lateral leads, these are slurred S waves. Okay, same thing in lead 1 and AVL. So you have the QR prime complexes in V1 to V2, and then you also have these slurred or wide S waves in V5, V6, 1, and AVL. Okay, and that's something that suggests a bundle branch block, specifically a right bundle branch block. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, is there anything else we missed here? I know there's quite a lot we've already covered. There is one thing I want to note, okay, and that is the low precordial lead voltage. Okay, what do I mean by that? Normally, when we have our QRS complexes, the top to bottom is our amplitude. Okay, in the precordial leads, which are V1 through V6, it should be at least 10 millimeters or more. If it's less than 10 millimeters, we call it low QRS voltage. In the limb leads, which are these here, okay, it should be at least 5 millimeters or more. Okay, now in the limb leads, if you look at lead 1, you can see that it kind of reaches that 5 millimeters, just barely. Okay, however, if you look at the precordial leads, these ones over here, it actually does not reach the 10 millimeter height. Now, it's longer or greater amplitude in the precordial leads because, as expected, these leads are the chest leads. They sit right on the chest. They're close to the heart. So actually, none of these reach 10 millimeters. Okay, so I would call this low QRS voltage, specifically in the precordial leads. Okay, not so much. It almost meets it in the limb leads, but not exactly. So we'll try to keep it to what's defined. Okay, so we'll say only here in the precordial leads. All right, next we want to look at R wave progression. Okay, in R wave progression, in this transitional zone, we're focusing only on these leads here. Okay, so these last two things, V1 through V6, are precordial leads. Now, normal R wave progression, you want to see from V1 to V5, so V1 all the way up to V5, an increase in the R wave amplitude. All right, now in this case, so normal R wave progression means an increase in R wave amplitude from V1 to V5, or an increase in the R to S wave ratio in V1 to V5. And that should make sense because as the R waves increase, the S waves should decrease. Now in this case, we're looking here at the initial one. We don't really even see R waves, okay, until here in V4 and V5. And because they don't come so early on in those anteroseptal leads, we call this a poor R wave progression. Okay, so poor R wave progression, it's not normal and likely indicates is from that prior infarct this patient had. Now the transitional zone is where we go from being mostly negative in our precordial leads. Okay, so again, these same leads from mostly negative to mostly positive. Okay, so let's look here. We are mostly, we're looking at the initial portion. Okay, so it's mostly negative. Okay, mostly negative, negative. Okay, and we're going from mostly negative to positive, and then again, when you compare this positive to that, it's still mostly negative. Okay, maybe isoelectric here and maybe somewhere between here. Now, normally, you should have complexes that look like this. Okay, where you see the transition from being mostly negative, so maybe I should add one here. So this would be V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, and V6, right? And notice that as we go up, the R wave progression increases. So that's what I mean by the R wave increasing. But the transition from mostly negative to positive should occur between here. So this mostly negative, still mostly negative, but this becomes mostly positive up here. So that's the normal transitional zone. When we look here, those initial complexes are not even positive in those anteroseptal leads, and they're occurring later, after this region, so we call this a late transition, okay, or a clockwise rotation. If they were to come before V3, we would call that an early transition or a counterclockwise rotation. Okay, so because they're occurring after V4, we call this a late, okay, or clockwise rotation. So either one you can use here. They mean the same thing. Now these last two things, we always mention that they depend on lead placement. Remember, these are the precordial leads, so it depends on the technician or whoever's doing the EKG where they're placing them. Okay, so highly dependent on lead placement, not a perfect science, but can be helpful in some situations. All right, so now let's put together everything we got here. Okay, so we have a rhythm that we said is a regular rhythm. It has a rate of 96 beats per minute, okay, and sinus rhythm. So what does that tell you right now? We have normal sinus rhythm, okay, normal rate, sinus rhythm, and regular, okay. So normal sinus rhythm. We also mentioned that we have a left axis deviation at negative 53 degrees, which may suggest a left anterior fascicular block. However, you have to keep in mind that you have this inferior infarct. So when you have an inferior infarct, you could just expect that you're going to have a leftward shift because that inferior region is pretty much dead. Okay, so if you have an inferior infarct and an axis beyond that negative 30 degrees or negative 45 degrees, you cannot call left anterior fascicular block. So in this case, we would not call this left anterior fascicular block, but rather an inferior infarct. Okay, so inferior infarct and likely an old one. Okay, the other thing we mentioned are normal atrial conduction, normal AV conduction, okay, no issues there, but a slightly prolonged QRS duration right at that upper limit, and some QR prime in V1 to V2, and the slurred S waves in those lateral leads. So because of that, we would call that a complete right bundle branch block. Okay, and we said that we're missing those initial R waves because of those Q waves in V1 to V3, which are the result of a former anteroseptal infarct. Okay, and this patient did have a prior one. Okay, and the other thing we mentioned was that the QTC interval. So there's a lot going on here. The QTC interval is prolonged, so we have to call that. Okay, and that's a prolonged QTC interval beyond the upper limits of normal. Okay, and the other thing was that low voltage. So there's a lot going on here. The low QRS voltage, and that is the precordial lead specifically. Okay, we said we didn't meet that there in the limb leads. It just made that upper limit of normal the 5 millimeters. Okay, so a lot going on here. The poor R wave progression, that late transition that we see here at the end, are likely from that prior anteroseptal infarct. Okay, and when we compare it to a previous EKG, now we have an increase in the QTC interval. Okay, and a decrease in the voltage, okay, actually throughout. So decrease in the voltage throughout, and you may wonder why was that? Well, this patient presenting with metastatic lung cancer and shortness of breath not only had bilateral pleural effusions, but also had a pericardial effusion, meaning that there was fluid around the heart that was diminishing that the electrical impulses that the electrodes could actually pick up, and that's why you see the low QRS voltage throughout. Okay, so she had a stage 4 lung cancer, metastatic, sad case of the 67-year-old female presenting to us this week. So final interpretation is normal sinus rhythm, complete right bundle branch block, an inferior and anteroseptal infarct that are likely old. Okay, We mentioned the prolonged QTC interval and this low QRS voltage in the precordial leads and barely not making it there in the limb leads. Okay, so a sad case, but a lot to learn here. Okay, and remember not to call a left anterior fascicular block in the presence of a prior inferior infarct. Okay, and that's one learning point for those advanced interpreters out there. Okay, well, that's the end of this week's EKG of the Week. I hope you learned something, and I look forward to seeing you back next time. Thank you. Now, I want to make you aware of our EKG coding reference that many of you are already using. How to get access, okay? So you want to go to this link here. So put in that link into into the computer, into your internet source, and then go to put your email address here when you get to that, and then you're going to use my password here to put in there. Make sure you're using my password every time, okay? And let me just erase here. So this one here, all lowercase, put that in, and then click submit. Confirm your email. So check your email, get a confirmation, and you'll have access, okay? And access here will be this, and you'll start to see that we have examples, and I'm now adding videos into it. So this is an on-the-go reference, has everything you could possibly imagine we use as we're building the course for our fellows here at Mayo Clinic, and so forth. So I think it's quite handy. Our techs are using it. We're using it for coding here as well. So very helpful way to learn, to use as a reference, and so forth. Okay, and you'll see a lot of the things we discussed in this lecture there as well. All right, so a few things. If you thought this was helpful, if you did, yes or no, I would like to know how I can improve, what kind of topics you want. Please leave them below. Like this video if you find this helpful, and share with friends. If you want more practice, okay, obviously more practice is on our Facebook page, where there's almost 500,000 of you there, and thank you for your support. We have daily questions, trying to get back to you between our clinics and making sure we're staying in touch. So go there for practice. There's daily practice. I leave resources. You can find us on Twitter, search the EKG Guy, YouTube obviously, and Facebook. Okay, it's hard to keep up with all these things, so find us there. Share with your friends if you find this helpful, and please leave a comment if there's any topic, or just kind words. We always appreciate it, and I hope you learned something today. Well, thank you for making us the largest, fastest growing EKG community in the world.